Hello there. Welcome to Fundamentals of Biology, where in this session we're going to be having a look at circulatory systems. So the aim of this session then is to have a look at circulatory systems in different types of animal, and then we'll have a look at open and closed circulatory systems, and then we'll go on to focus on the mammalian circulatory system, and then finish off by looking at the main components of mammalian blood. So those are the topics that we're going to be covering, so you should be able to describe each one of those by the end of this session. So as an introduction then, the circulatory system is the primary method used to transport nutrients and gases throughout an animal's body. So in the previous session we looked at gas exchange, so getting oxygen into the body and getting waste carbon dioxide out. But when you start looking at different types of animals, you realize that they have sort of different challenges, and they're different sizes, they live in different habitats. But one thing's true with all of them is they when they get those gases in, when they get oxygen into the body, they need to be able to get it around the body. Oxygen needs to get to all parts of the body, as does nutrients, and as do waste products. They need to be collected up from all parts of the body. So animals require some form of circulatory system, and as we'll see as we go through, they come in a lot of different types. So simple diffusion can be enough for some animals. So simple diffusion will allow water, nutrients, waste, and also gas exchange to occur, but it only works in animals that are only a few cell layers thick. So down here on the left-hand side, we can see jellyfish, which belong to the phylum Cnidaria, which we'll have a look at in a sec. But those are examples of animals that can rely largely on simple diffusion. But as you start to get more complex and you get larger, you need to start moving things around a larger area. So bulk flow is the only method by which the entire body of larger, more complex organisms can be accessed. So obviously we've got the picture of the rhino there as a good example of a large animal that has a large complex body, and you've got lots of different parts of that body, but all parts require oxygen. They're producing waste products that need to be collected. They require nutrients. So you need a really good system of circulation to deliver things to those parts of the body. So I just mentioned jellyfish and the fact that they can rely on simple diffusion. And here we can see a diagram of a jellyfish. So simple animals like those in the phylum Cnidaria, so those are jellyfish, corals, sea anemones, they don't have a true circulatory system as we would recognize in something like mammals, like ourselves, for instance. Instead, they have mainly two layers of tissue that are separated by a gastrovascular cavity. So you can imagine they've got an outer layer and an inner layer of tissue, and then in between those two layers, they have a gastrovascular cavity, which is accessed, if we look at the diagram here on the left, it's accessed by the mouth, and this actually acts as the anus as well. So they have one mouth and anus, and then what they will do is draw water in through the mouth, and then that goes into the gastrovascular cavity, where it can be distributed along these radial canals and around the circular canal that runs around the circumference of the animal. And then it's just relying on simple diffusion, so the diffusion of nutrients and waste products and gases from the gastrovascular cavity into the two layers of tissue. And then waste products will diffuse into the cavity and then pass back out of the mouth, which, as I said, acts as an anus as well. So they're not relying on a true circulatory system where you've got a heart that is pumping things like blood around the body. Instead, they are bringing water into the mouth, and then they are just relying on simple diffusion. This only works if you have quite a limited amount of cells and quite a limited size in terms of the depth of tissue, because diffusion will diminish it. It slows down the thicker a tissue layer gets. So diffusion only really works if you've got a very, very thin layer of tissue. It's the same principle that we talked about in the previous session where we looked at gas exchange. So when you want to be a larger animal, or you want to have a more complex lifestyle, so you want to be able to move of your own volition. We looked at jellyfish previously, and a lot of cnidarians are either sessile, so corals and anemones are typically largely sessile, so they stay in one place. Or like jellyfish, they're largely planktonic. They're at the mercy of the tides and currents within the ocean. So they don't need a complex circulatory system to transport gases and nutrients around the body. But when you want to actually move around, you want to have either a larger, more complex body, or you want to live a more active lifestyle. Well, you need to be able to then deliver nutrients and gases to all parts of the body to be able to do that. So when we start looking at insects, for instance, and arthropods in general, as well as most mollusks, what we start to see is the evolution of a more specific and more detailed circulatory system. They're not relying on simple diffusion now. It's a much more dedicated circulatory system. So what we can see here is that in arthropods and most mollusks, blood will bathe the organs directly in an open circulatory system. So you can see that they have a heart and they have some blood vessels as well, which I'll explain in a second. But important to note is that unlike our system, which is a closed circulatory system, which I'll explain on the next slide, in arthropods and most mollusks that have this open circulatory system, they have a mixture of blood and interstitial fluid, and that's actually called hemolymph. In our systems, in closed systems, you have blood that is kept within our heart and blood vessels, and then we have the interstitial fluid that bathes our cells. So oxygen, for instance, will diffuse from the blood into our interstitial fluid and then into our cells. And then carbon dioxide will diffuse from our cell to our interstitial fluid into our blood. With an open circulatory system, you just have a mixture of blood and interstitial fluid, which is called hemolymph, and that will bathe all of the tissues within the body. What we can see here with this open system, these animals will have a tubular heart. So this is a heart that runs dorsally and it runs the length of the body. And then you have pores called ostia all the way through the heart. And then coming off of the tubular heart, you will have these sinuses, these little pipes, if you like, that poke off, and they're called sinuses. And then what will happen is that the heart will contract and it squirts the hemolymph out of these sinuses, and then you can see the directional arrows here. It will swoosh around the inside of the body, delivering the oxygen or nutrients, more in this case, because these animals are relying on their tracheal system for breathing or for gas exchange. So they're more relying here on swooshing around the nutrients and waste products. And then when the tubular heart relaxes, it will then suck that hemolymph in through these pores, in through these ostia, back into the heart. And then it contracts again and it swooshes the hemolymph back around the body. And the fact that these animals have an exoskeleton is really useful for this, because that hard exoskeleton will help to direct the hemolymph around the body. So this is an open system of circulation. It's open in the sense that the hemolymph is actually just open within the cavities of the body. You're relying on pressure created by the tubular heart to basically pump that hemolymph around the body, but it is not contained within specific blood vessels. You just have this mixture of blood and interstitial fluid. The benefits of having an open circulatory system is it's way less complicated than a closed system, which we'll look at on the next slide. So it's cheaper to run and maintain. There's less things that can go wrong with it. But the downsides to it are it does limit you to the size and complexity you can have in terms of your body. So you're going to have limitations on how large you can get whilst maintaining this open system. it tends, as I said, to work better with animals that have this hard exoskeleton as well. So open circulatory systems do a great job. They're a step up from what we see within the cnidarians that are just relying on diffusion. Well, now you've actually got the ability to pump blood, or hemolymph in this case, around the body, so you can pump nutrients around the body to supply muscles and organs and other tissues with the nutrients they require, so you can lead a more active life. But like I said, it does have its limitations, so you do tend to find it restricts the size and complexity that these animals can attain. So moving on from the open system, we have closed system of circulation. And this is where blood is separated from interstitial fluid, and it is separated into vessels. So in humans or in mammals, that will be your heart, your arteries, your veins, your capillaries. Those are your blood vessels. And then, as I said just now, the interstitial fluid is the fluid that bathes your cells. So things will diffuse from the blood into the interstitial fluid and then into the cells and then back again. Closed systems of circulation rely on a heart to pump blood through vessels, and then diffusion allows the exchange between the blood and the interstitial fluid. So what type of animals do we find with a closed system of circulation? Well, we're looking at earthworms, some mollusks, so squid and octopus, or octopuses will have closed systems of circulation, and all vertebrates. Okay, so there's quite a wide range of animals there. You don't often think of vertebrates and earthworms and squid having similar systems, but in this case, all of these animals, including ourselves, have closed systems of circulation. So what are the plus points of this? Well, a closed circulatory system means that you can be a larger, more complex animal with higher metabolic demands, because by containing the blood within vessels, you can pump it at a much higher pressure so it can move faster around the body. So you can deliver more nutrients, more oxygen, you can get rid of waste products more efficiently, more quickly, and over a greater distance. So it enables the animal to become larger, more complex, and have more active lifestyles, and more consistently active lifestyles. But it comes at a cost. So what are the costs of having a closed system? Well, they're more effective at meeting high metabolic demands, as I said, but that comes at a cost of being more complex. So you have that with greater complexity, there's the concern that things could go wrong. So with all of those blood vessels, with all of those arteries and veins and capillaries, they can become damaged, they can become blocked. So over time, you can end up failing, or they can end up failing, causing death or injury. Also, it just requires more upkeep. It requires more energy to build in the first place, and more energy to actually maintain. So you've got a trade-off there. It's more risky, more things can go wrong, and it's energetically more expensive to build and maintain. But the benefits will outweigh those costs, because otherwise evolution would very likely have gotten rid of these closed systems of circulation. Instead, we find that they are very, very common across a wide range of animals. And like I said, it's because they meet these higher metabolic demands to enable animals to become more active and larger. When we talk specifically about the circulatory systems of vertebrates, we know that we're talking about closed circulatory systems, but what we can see in the diagram here is that they're not all the same. So different groups of vertebrates will have slightly different systems, all built on the same theme, but slightly different. We can separate these into two distinct categories, and those are single and double circulatory systems. And only one group of vertebrates has a single circulatory system, and that's the fish. So we can see here on the left-hand side, a fish's circulatory system has a two-chambered heart, so it has one atrium. So when we talk about circulatory systems and hearts, you will hear veins and arteries and capillaries as the main blood vessels. Now, veins deliver blood to the heart, and arteries take blood away from the heart. So that's a good way of always remembering them. Veins deliver blood to the heart, arteries take blood away from the heart, and veins will deliver blood to an atrium. Okay, so the atria, or the atrium in this case, because it's just one of them, are the receiving parts of the heart. So we can see that a fish's heart has one atrium, and then the ventricle is the pumping part of the heart. It's the part of the heart that will actually pump the blood around the body. So fish have one atrium and they have one ventricle. Blood is deoxygenated blood. So this is blood that has been around the body. It's dropped off its oxygen and it's picked up its carbon dioxide. That returns to the atrium. It moves to the ventricle, where it then gets pumped to the gills first. So you can see up here what's happening with the gills. So blue represents the deoxygenated blood, red is oxygenated blood. So the deoxygenated blood comes to the gills, where gas exchange takes place. We talked about that in the previous session. The blood is reoxygenated, and then it moves around something called the systemic circuit. So the systemic circuit is all other parts of the body, basically. So it's all of your organs and all of your other tissues, from your brain to the tips of your toes. That all comes under the systemic circuit. So the oxygenated blood is delivered around the systemic circuit. So you can see down here, this occurs in the capillary beds within the tissues. So oxygen is dropped off, carbon dioxide is picked up, and then the deoxygenated blood returns to the atrium, where it then goes around the whole process again. So fish actually have pretty low blood pressure because of this two-chambered heart. What we find with all other vertebrates is that they have a double circulatory system. Okay, so fish have a single. All other vertebrates, so amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, have double circulatory systems. And what that means is that the deoxygenated blood goes to the heart, it then gets pumped to get reoxygenated, and then it comes back to the heart before it gets pumped again to go around the systemic circuit. So that's the key about a double circulatory system. It gets pumped to the lungs typically, but in amphibians we know that it also goes to the skin. It gets reoxygenated, then it returns back to the heart before it gets pumped again to go around the systemic circuit. That enables these animals to maintain higher blood pressure. So if we look here, we can still see some differences though. So let's look at the amphibians first. They have a three-chambered heart. So the fish just had the two-chambered. An amphibian has a three-chambered heart. It has a right and a left atrium. So remember, the atria are the receiving parts of the heart. And then they have a single ventricle for pumping. So deoxygenated blood comes to the right atrium. It moves down to the ventricle, where it gets pumped around the pulmocutaneous circuit. So pulmo refers to the lungs. Cutaneous refers to the skin. So we know that amphibians will carry out gas exchange across their skin and also in their lungs. So that's what's meant by this term, pulmocutaneous. So the blood gets reoxygenated, so it drops off its carbon dioxide, brings in nice new oxygen. It then returns to the left atrium of the heart, where it moves down into the ventricle, and then it gets pumped around the systemic circuit. So that's around all other parts of the body, dropping off its oxygen, picking up CO2, and then it comes back to the heart again. So this system isn't the most efficient system that you can get because you have just one ventricle. So you do get a mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood there. And for a long time, we thought that this was a poorly evolved system, and it just wasn't as efficient as ours, for instance. But there's been some pretty recent research on this over the last few years that shows that the system actually works very well for amphibians, and it's perfectly suited to their way of life. So it's not just it's not a badly put together system. It's fit for purpose for the way that amphibians live. When we move on to reptiles, we see something interesting. We see the move towards a four-chambered heart, although it's not entirely a four-chambered heart. So let's follow the process through again, because what we can see is that we still have a right and a left atrium. And then you can see here that we're starting to get into a separation of the ventricles. So you can see the right ventricle here and the left ventricle here. But in a lot of reptiles, you do still get a slight mixing of deoxygenated and oxygenated blood up here. So this tissue that separates the ventricles is called the septum. And in most reptiles, the septum isn't complete. There's a gap at the top. But in crocodilians, for instance, this does tend to be fully separated. So you have a 4-chambered heart. And then apart from that, it's what you would expect. You've got the deoxygenated blood returns to the right atrium, moves to the right ventricle, gets pumped around the lungs, it gets reoxygenated back to the left atrium, moves to the left ventricle, and then gets pumped around the systemic circuit. The obvious difference here within reptiles is that they have this right systemic aorta. And this is a really interesting component of reptilian circulatory systems that we don't see in other animals. And what this enables the reptiles to do, and we see this a lot in animals like crocodiles, is that they can do something called an aortic shunt. And that means that they can divert blood from their lungs back to the right systemic aorta so they can start or send it back to the systemic circuit. And there's a couple of suggestions for why they do this. The one main one seems to be that you have carbon dioxide rich blood going to the lungs. And as we've discussed in previous sessions, when carbon dioxide dissolves in water, including blood plasma, it will become acidic. A part of that carbon dioxide turns into carbonic acid. So if you pump that carbon dioxide or acidic blood back to the digestive system, so it goes back around the systemic circuit, you can increase the acidity of the stomach, for instance, which can help with digesting a large meal. And if you think about the way that crocodiles feed, for instance, well, they can go long periods without food, and then when they do get a chance to feed, they will quite often eat very, very large prey items, and they will be complete prey items. So they'll be consuming hoofs and horns and teeth and fur and all kinds of things that require a lot of digesting. So they can divert carbon dioxide rich blood to help increase the acidity of the digestive system. One other suggestion that I've seen for this is that it enables them to, if you think about how how reptiles live, they regulate their temperature by basking and moving into the shade to cool down, basking to warm up. And if you're basking, you're not doing a lot of energetic work. They're literally just trying to warm up to get their body temperature up. So you're not having to send a lot of your blood to the surface, to the lungs, because your muscles don't have a lot of energy requirements. So instead, what you can do is send your blood back to the surface of the skin. So you've got more blood flow to the surface of the skin, where it can absorb more energy from the sun, so it can warm up more quickly. The third suggestion that I've seen for this is that it will help them, particularly crocodilians, when they spend a lot of time underwater. It will enable them to stay submerged for longer. So there's again no point in sending blood to the lungs when you're submerged underwater, because you can't breathe. So instead, you can just focus on sending the blood around the systemic circuit, maximizing the removal of oxygen from the blood. So there's a few examples of possible reasons for the right systemic aorta in reptiles. When we move on to birds and mammals, we have a fully formed 4-chambered heart. So we've got a very distinct right and left atrium, and then we've got a fully formed right and left ventricle. And just as we've seen already, deoxygenated blood returns to the right atrium, moves to the right ventricle where it gets pumped to the lungs, and then after it's reoxygenated, it comes back to the left atrium, left ventricle, and then goes around the systemic circuit. So there we can see the 5 main groups of vertebrates and the way that their circulatory systems are all based around the similar theme, but there are some slight differences. But what I want to do next is just focus on the circulatory system in mammals. And this kind of goes through what we've already been through on the previous diagram, but it's quite nice to have a look at it in a bit more detail on this diagram. So we can follow it through. Let's start obviously with number 1. So here we are in the right ventricle. Okay, so the right ventricle, remember, blue shows deoxygenated blood, red shows oxygenated blood. So we're in the right ventricle of the heart. The heart will contract. Blood will then move up here into the pulmonary arteries. So you can see the labels here. Remember, arteries take blood away from the heart. So the pulmonary arteries are delivering blood from the heart to the lungs, which you can see here. So going to the right and the left lung. The blood then gets reoxygenated in the alveoli, and then the oxygenated blood returns to the left atrium, which you can see here at number 4. The blood will then move from the left atrium to the left ventricle, and you can see that the black lines here show the walls of the heart. So you can see how thick the walls of the heart are. Well, this is just muscle, and it needs to be a muscular organ because it has to do a lot of pumping. So it needs to deliver that blood all the way around the body. So the left ventricle is the main pumping part of the blood for delivering oxygenated blood around the body. So when it contracts, blood will move up here into the aorta, and then it will separate, taking blood to the head and forelimbs, and then also to the abdominal organs in the hind limbs, or for us, our legs. So we can see here then that the blood then enters into our capillary beds, which permeate our tissues. And then oxygen is dropped off, carbon dioxide is picked up, and then deoxygenated blood returns from the posterior vena cava. So that's delivering blood from our abdominal organs and hind limbs. The anterior vena cava from our head and forelimbs. And both of those will feed in to number 11 here, which is the right atrium. And then that blood will then move into the right ventricle, and the whole process starts again. So that is the flow of blood through the mammalian circulatory system. So here we can see a close-up of the mammalian heart. As I've mentioned previously, it's made up of mostly cardiac muscle. If you look at the walls here, you can see that the atria, so up here we can see the right atrium, and then over here we've got the left atrium. And you can see how the walls here are quite thin, and that's because they're not having to pump blood over a great distance. They're literally just contracting and moving blood into the ventricles. The ventricles, on the other hand, so the right ventricle is pumping blood to the lungs. The left ventricle is pumping blood around the systemic circuit, so they have to pump blood over a much greater distance, and they have much thicker walls, so much thicker muscle there for powering that flow of blood. What we also find is that there are a network of valves within the heart to prevent the backflow of blood. So we have the atrioventricular valves, so you can see them here between the atria and the ventricles. So you can imagine that blood moves from the atrium into the ventricle. Well, now when the ventricle contracts, you only want blood moving out in this direction. So from the right ventricle, you want blood pumping up into the pulmonary arteries. You don't want it flowing back into the right atrium, because you would lose a lot of blood pressure then, so you wouldn't be able to get the flow of blood in the right direction. So you have these valves that will close, so when the ventricles contract, the blood will not be able to move back into the atrium. Same over here for the left ventricle, where you've got the valve up here. We also have the semilunar valves. So we've got one here to prevent the backflow of blood back into the right ventricle, and then there's one up here as well to prevent the backflow of blood from the aorta into the left ventricle. So you can imagine the right ventricle again here, when it contracts, blood pumps up here, but when that ventricle relaxes, well, blood will want to flow backwards. And you do not want that. You don't want blood flowing back into the ventricles because it would just keep moving forward and back, forward and back. You want it moving forward at all times. So you've got the semilunar valves here that will clamp shut, and then when the walls of the the muscular walls of the heart relax, the blood will come back and it will hit those valves, and it won't be able to move back into the ventricles. So when you actually hear your heart thumping, the ba-bump, 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 what you're actually hearing there is the blood pushing up against those valves. And if you've got if you know somebody with a heart murmur, well, one of the things that can cause the main thing that can cause a heart murmur is where you've got a slightly leaky valve. And if you know somebody well enough and they don't mind you putting your head on their chest, you can actually hear sometimes, if it's a big enough heart murmur, you can actually hear a hissing noise. So you can hear the boom, boom, and that's where there's a slightly leaky valve. And when the ventricles contract, you get the flow of blood back into the atrium. And it's obviously not a good position to be in. So that's the mammalian heart. When we are dealing with blood pressure, it will change as you work or as you move throughout the body, depending on a number of things. And that's what this diagram shows. So at first glance, this is not the prettiest looking diagram. But once we break it down, it's actually really, really interesting. And it tells us a lot of interesting bits of information about the flow of blood through our body. So let's have a look at this diagram then, and then I'll walk you through it. So let's go down the bottom first. So what we can see here is the flow of blood in the direction it travels from the heart. So the left ventricle will contract, and then the blood moves out here into the aorta. It will then move into arteries. So the aorta will branch off into arteries. Our arteries will then branch off into arterioles. Okay, so you can follow it through this diagram here. So the aorta is the big thick one, and then that branches off into slightly smaller arteries, and then those arteries will branch off into even smaller arterioles, and then those arterioles will spread out or separate out into even smaller capillaries. So if you remember, the capillaries are the blood vessels that are very, very thin. They permeate all of our tissues, and they are the ones where you are getting the diffusion of gases and nutrients across. So we have a vast amount of capillary beds within our bodies. They cover a huge surface area. Once the blood has been through the capillary beds, it's dropped off nutrients and gas and oxygen, and it's picked up waste products and carbon dioxide. It will then move from the capillary beds into venules, and then the venules will start grouping together into veins, and then the veins will group together into the vena cava. So you remember we have the anterior and the posterior vena cava, which will then deliver blood back to the right atrium. So that's the flow of blood from the heart back to the heart. And what we can see up here on the top part of this diagram is the surface area, the amount of area that the different blood vessels cover. So we can see that the aorta and the vena cava, they're not particularly large. They don't cover a particularly large surface area. They're like a wide hose pipe, essentially. But then as you start branching off into the smaller arterioles, you start to get more and more area, until you ultimately get into the capillary beds, which cover a massive area because they permeate all of our tissues. And they have to cover such a wide area because they need to be so thin to enable diffusion. And then once you move out of the capillary beds into the venules, well, you start grouping together again. So the area covered gets smaller until ultimately you get back to the vena cava and then back to the heart. Velocity is opposite of the area. You can see here in the aorta, our blood is at its fastest because you're in a much smaller area. So all of that blood that's being pumped out of the left ventricle is being shot from the left ventricle out into the aorta. Well, it's very, very quick at that point. But as you start branching out into the smaller but larger areas of the arteries, and then into the arterioles, and then into the capillary beds, the velocity of the blood drops off dramatically, particularly when you're in the capillary beds. And that's largely because you have such a huge area of them. And it's also really important. You don't want blood shooting through the capillary beds. You want it to move through slowly to enable the diffusion of gases in and out and also nutrients. As you move from the capillary beds and you start grouping into the venules and the veins, you start to pick up velocity, but notice that you don't reach, even in the vena cava, you don't reach the same velocity that you had in the aorta. And that's because you've lost a lot of that velocity through friction through all of these blood vessels. The next one, the last part down here, we see pressure. And pressure is, we discuss pressure when it comes to circulatory systems we use two main terms, systolic and diastolic pressure. So systolic pressure is what you get during ventricle contraction or ventricular contraction. So your left ventricles contract, that gives you systolic pressure. When the ventricles relax, and you basically get the buildup of pressure left over from the contractions in your arteries that have an elastic wall, well, that is diastolic pressure. So we can see up here that pressure is highest during ventricular systole, so that is when they are contracting, and lowest during ventricular diastole, so that is when they are relaxed, which kind of makes sense, doesn't it? So that's when you see this up and down line, this wavy line here, when you're looking at a blood pressure readout, that's what it refers to. So the peaks are the systolic pressure, and the troughs are the diastolic pressure. So you'll often see for a typical adult human, sort of from sort of 25 to 45 or something, a typical blood pressure will be 120/70, around that range. And that refers to 120 being the systolic pressure and the 70 being the diastolic pressure. So what you can see here, though, is in the aorta and the arteries, we still have high blood pressure because the ventricle has contracted. So there's a lot of blood flowing quite quickly through those blood vessels. But because you also have the impedance of the arterial, so you're trying to filter a large volume of blood into the narrow arterioles and capillaries, you get this backlog of blood that causes the arteries to actually swell. And this is something that we call peripheral resistance. Okay, so diastole is still relatively high in pressure due to the impedance by the arterioles and the capillaries. And that's peripheral resistance. Blood has to filter into those narrower blood vessels. So what we tend to find is that our blood pressure is dictated by cardiac output, so how much blood is being pumped out by our heart, but also by peripheral resistance, so how much of our blood is being pumped to these arterioles and capillary beds. And as you can see here, by the time you get into the venules and the veins and the vena cava, the blood pressure is dropped considerably. And again, a lot of that is because that blood pressure has been lost essentially through impedance, through the movement of blood into the arterioles and the capillaries. Blood pressure in our veins and vena cava is actually very, very low. So when you're moving blood from the legs or from your feet, for instance, back up to the heart, we rely on muscle contractions in our legs and also one-way valves to prevent the backflow of blood down the legs. And also, like I said, relying on muscle contractions to help move the blood back towards the heart. So the last thing to mention here is the main components of blood. I think it's quite easy to consider blood to be a very simple substance. And you've got red blood cells in there that deliver oxygen around the body, and it's quite easy to think of it in that way. But there's a lot more going on here with our blood. So let's have a look at the two main types of components. So we have the blood plasma, and then we have the cellular components of the blood. So the blood plasma, you see here, makes up about 55% of the blood. Its main constituent is water. And that water is really important because as we've discussed previously, water is an excellent solvent. So you can dissolve things like certain gases and like certain nutrients. You can dissolve it in your water, and then you can use that water to transport those materials, those nutrients around the body. So it's a solvent for carrying other substances. But we also have electrolytes in our blood. So these are really important ions. So sodium, potassium, calcium, and so on and so forth that you can see there. And these play a really important role in osmotic balance, so maintaining the osmolarity of our blood, but buffering our pH, and therefore regulating the permeability of our membranes. We also get lots of proteins in our blood. So albumin, again, helps with osmotic balance and pH. But we also get fibrinogen, which is an important component for clotting. And we get antibodies that are an important component of our immune system. And then alongside that, we get all of the substances that are being transported by the blood. So our nutrients that we've talked about, glucose, fatty acid, vitamins. But you've also got the waste products of metabolism and the respiratory gases that we've talked about, so oxygen and CO2, but also hormones that are being transported by the blood system as well. The cellular elements come in a few main types. So we've got our erythrocytes, or red blood cells, that are essential for transporting oxygen and carbon dioxide. We also get the immune cells, so leukocytes, or white blood cells. So they are really important in defense and immunity, and they come in a few different types that you can see there. And then we have fragments of cells. So these are called platelets, and these play a really important role in blood clotting. Okay, so those are the main components of our blood that makes blood a very, very important type of connective tissue. So it's a lot more than just a watery substance with red blood cells. There's a lot more going on there than that. Okay, so as always, just to finish up on this introduction to circulatory systems, then let's do 5 questions. I'll read through them and then give you 5 minutes to answer them, and then we'll go through the answers together. So question number 1, what substances are transported in circulatory systems? Number 2, name a group of animals that do not have a true circulatory system. Number 3, what type of circulatory system do arthropods have? Number 4, which system brings oxygenated blood back to the heart before pumping it around the systemic circuit? And then number 5, which blood vessels deliver blood to the lungs? Okay, so 5 questions there. Have a go at answering them. I'll give you 5 minutes to do that, and then we'll go through the answers together. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you've had a chance to answer those now. So let's go through the answers together. So number 1, what substances are transported in circulatory systems? I missed out the "in" on that one. I'm sorry about that. But we basically have nutrients and gases. Those are the main things that are being delivered. You can also mention the fact that we're sort of transporting antibodies and white blood cells and things like that around as well. But typically we're talking about nutrients and gases. Number 2, name a group of animals that do not have a true circulatory system. Well, we're talking there about the cnidarians that are relying on simple diffusion. So jellyfish, corals, and anemones are examples of cnidarians. Number 3, what type of circulatory system do arthropods have? They have open systems of circulation. So those tubular hearts with the combined blood and interstitial fluid that we call hemolymph. Number 4, which system brings oxygenated blood back to the heart before pumping it around the systemic circuit? Well, that's a double circulatory system that we see in vertebrates apart from fish. And then number 5, which blood vessels deliver blood to the lungs? That's the pulmonary arteries. So hopefully you did okay with those. So that was a gentle introduction, hopefully, to circulatory systems. So hopefully you'd be able to now describe the circulatory systems in different groups of animals. And you'd be able to describe the differences between open and closed circulatory systems. You'd be able to describe the basics of the mammalian circulatory system and the flow of blood around it, and then also the main components of blood. So hopefully that was useful, and I will see you in the next session. Thanks very much.